Margaret Whitmore's fork stopped halfway to her mouth the moment she heard her son laugh at something his new wife had whispered to him. It was a small sound, barely noticeable to anyone else at the table, but to Margaret it felt like a warning bell. She set the fork down slowly and studied the young woman sitting beside Nathaniel, the woman who had, only 6 weeks earlier, become the newest member of the Whitmore family. Alina Reyes sat with her hands folded politely in her lap, smiling at everyone the way a guest smiles at strangers she is trying very hard to please. She wore a soft green dress that Margaret privately thought was too plain for a family dinner at the Whitmore estate, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid instead of the elaborate styles the other women in the family favored. She looked, Margaret decided, like someone who had wandered into the wrong house and was too polite to leave. "Tell us again, dear, how you and Nathaniel met," Margaret said, her voice sweet in the way that made everyone at the table sit up a little straighter. It was not really a question. It was a test, though Alina did not seem to notice. "At a charity dinner," Alina said, her English careful and a little slow, as though she were choosing each word from a shelf before setting it down. "Nathaniel spilled wine on my dress. He apologized for 10 minutes. Claire Whitmore, Nathaniel's younger sister, let out a short laugh that was not quite unkind but not quite kind either. 10 minutes. That sounds like him, always so thorough about the wrong things. I thought it was sweet," Alina said, and smiled at Nathaniel across the table. He smiled back, warm and unguarded, the way he had smiled at her since the day they met. The staff moved quietly around the long table, refilling glasses and clearing small plates, while the late afternoon light came through the tall windows of the dining room and turned the white tablecloth gold. It was a beautiful room, built for beautiful conversations, and Margaret had spent 30 years making sure that every conversation held inside it served the family's interests. She did not intend to stop now, especially not for a woman she barely knew. "And your family, Alina," Margaret continued, cutting into her chicken with precise, unhurried movements. "Remind me what your father does." "He works with numbers," Alina said, "for a company in the city." "An accountant, then," Margaret said, as though she were placing a small stone on a shelf where it belonged. "Something like that," Alina said and looked down at her plate. Nathaniel reached over and squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture so small that only Alina noticed it, and it seemed to steady her the way a single word of comfort sometimes can. He had told his mother more than once that Alina was brilliant, that she had studied at some of the best schools in the world, that she understood things about business and money that most people in this very room could not begin to grasp. But Margaret had heard many things about many women over the years, and she had learned not to believe compliments spoken by men who were in love. Across the table, Claire leaned toward her mother and lowered her voice just slightly, though not so much that it seemed like a secret. "She barely says 2 full sentences without stopping to think. I don't understand what Nathaniel sees in her." "Looks mostly," Margaret said, equally quiet though her eyes never left Alina's face. "And perhaps she is kind. Kindness is not nothing. But this family needs more than kindness. It needs someone who can stand in a room and not shrink." What neither of them noticed, what no one at that table noticed, was the way Alina's eyes moved when they spoke, the way her expression did not change but something behind it sharpened, just for a moment, before softening again into polite confusion. She had heard every word. She simply chose, for now, to let them believe she had not. Dinner continued the way it always did at the Whitmore estate, with careful conversation about business deals, about upcoming events, about people neither Margaret nor Claire particularly liked but felt obligated to discuss anyway. Alina mostly listened, offering small comments here and there, always a beat slower than the rest of the table, always phrased simply, as though she were still learning the shape of the language. It was William, the family's longtime butler, who first began to wonder if something did not add up. He had worked for the Whitmores for over 20 years, long enough to know every member of the family by the sound of their footsteps alone, and long enough to develop a quiet skill for reading people that none of them ever gave him credit for. He noticed that Alina's eyes moved to the newspaper on the side table when she thought no one was looking, scanning the financial section with quick, practiced ease before setting it back down exactly as it had been. He noticed that she sometimes corrected small errors in the household accounts before handing them back to the housekeeper, gently, without ever mentioning that she had done so. He said nothing to the family. It was not his place, but he watched and he wondered. After dinner, the family moved to the sitting room, where a fire had been lit against the cool evening air. Nathaniel's father, Edward Whitmore, a tall man with silver hair and the tired eyes of someone who had spent his whole life managing other people's expectations, poured drinks for everyone and settled into his favorite chair. "How is the new wing of the office building coming along, Nathaniel?" he asked, more out of habit than curiosity. "On schedule," Nathaniel said. "Alina actually looked over the numbers last week. Told me the contractor's estimate for the electrical work seemed high." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. Did she now? "She was right," Nathaniel said, unable to hide the small note of pride in his voice. "I had the team check it again. We saved almost $40,000. For a moment, the room was quiet. Claire glanced at Alina with something that might have been suspicion, quickly hidden behind a sip of her drink. Margaret's expression did not change at all, but something in the stillness of her posture suggested she was recalculating something in her mind, the way one recalculates a sum that has come out wrong. "How fortunate," Margaret said finally. "A lucky guess." "Maybe," Alina said softly, and smiled the same polite, harmless smile she always wore in this house. "I am glad it helped." She did not explain that she had spent 6 years studying finance at 2 different universities, one in her mother's home country and one abroad, before working for 3 years at an investment firm that handled contracts far larger and far more complicated than the Whitmore family's office building. She did not explain that numbers had always come easily to her, the way music comes easily to some people and math to others, and that she had simply looked at the estimate and known, almost instantly, that something did not match. She had learned over the past 6 weeks that it was easier to be underestimated than to be questioned. When people believed you were simple, they left you alone. They spoke freely in front of you. They showed you exactly who they were without bothering to hide it, because they did not think you were paying attention. And Alina Heir'S, whatever else she might have been, was always paying attention. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to embers and the rest of the family had gone up to their rooms, Nathaniel found Alina standing by the window in their bedroom, looking out at the dark shape of the gardens below. "You okay?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Your mother does not like me very much," Alina said. It was not a complaint. It was simply an observation, stated the way she stated most things, calmly and without much emotion attached. "She doesn't know you yet," Nathaniel said. "Give her time." "Time," Alina repeated, and something flickered behind her eyes, something Nathaniel did not quite catch. "Yes, I think that is exactly what I need." She did not tell him what she was thinking. She did not tell him that she had noticed the way his mother and sister spoke about her when they believed she could not fully understand. The small comments dropped like pebbles into a pond, meant to test the depth of the water without making a splash. She did not tell him that she had decided, somewhere between the second course and the dessert, that she would let them believe whatever story made them comfortable for now. Because Alina Heir'S had grown up in a house where her mother spoke one language and her father spoke another, where she had learned early in life that the person who says the least often understands the most. She had learned, in boardrooms full of men twice her age who assumed a young woman with a soft voice could not possibly grasp the details of a merger agreement, that being underestimated was not always a curse. Sometimes it was the sharpest tool a person could carry into a room. She turned away from the window and kissed her husband good night, and if there was a small, private smile tucked into the corner of her mouth as she closed her eyes, it was one that no one in the Whitmore house would notice for weeks to come. The next morning brought its own quiet tensions. Alina rose early, as she always did, long before the rest of the household stirred, and made her way down to the kitchen for coffee. She found Margaret already there, standing by the counter with a cup in her hands, looking out at the garden with the particular stillness of someone who had been awake for hours turning over private thoughts. "You are up early," Margaret said without turning around. "I like the quiet," Elena said. "Before everyone wakes up, it is peaceful." "I used to feel the same way," Margaret said. "Before I had children, before I had a house full of people who needed things from me every hour of the day." She turned then, finally, and looked at Elena directly, her eyes sharp despite the softness of her voice. "You will find, if you stay in this family long enough, that peace becomes a very rare thing." "I do not mind hard work," Elena said. "That is not quite what I meant," Margaret said, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, though the words themselves carried an edge. "This family is not simple, Elena. There are expectations here that go beyond hard work. There is history. There is money that must be protected, relationships that must be managed, a name that must be carried carefully, like a piece of glass that has already been cracked once and cannot survive being dropped a second time. I wonder sometimes if Nathaniel has explained any of this to you, or if he was too busy falling in love to mention it." Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and considered her answer carefully, the way she considered most things. "He has told me some of it," she said. "I think I understand more than you believe I do." Margaret studied her for a long moment, and for just a second something flickered across her face, something that might have been curiosity or suspicion or both at once. Then it was gone, replaced by the same composed expression she wore for the rest of the world. "We shall see," Margaret said and set down her cup. "Claire and I are hosting a dinner next week. Investors mostly, people your husband will need on his side once he takes over more of the business. I trust you will be there." "Of course," Elena said. "Good," Margaret said, moving toward the door. She paused there, one hand resting on the frame, and looked back at Elena with an expression that was almost, but not quite, a warning. "Try to make a good impression this time. First impressions matter a great deal in this family, and I am afraid yours has not been the strongest." She left the kitchen without waiting for a response, her footsteps fading down the hallway, and Elena stood alone in the quiet morning light, turning the coffee cup slowly in her hands. She was not upset. She had faced far colder rooms than this one, far sharper words than the ones Margaret Whitmore had just spoken. But something in her had shifted overnight, some quiet decision settling into place the way a key settles into a lock. She thought of her mother, who had crossed an ocean with nothing but 2 suitcases, and a determination that refused to bend under anyone's doubt. She thought of the professors who had once told her, gently but firmly, that finance was not really a field for someone like her, and the quiet satisfaction of proving, year after year, exactly how wrong they had been. She thought of her father, patient and steady, who had taught her that the person who listens most carefully is usually the one who wins in the end. Elena Heir'S finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it carefully in the drying rack. Outside, the sun was rising fully now over the Whitmore gardens, catching the dew on the grass and turning it briefly, brilliantly gold. She had 6 days until the investor dinner. 6 days to continue being exactly who they expected her to be, quiet and sweet and easily overlooked. She intended to make good use of every one of them. The 6 days passed the way most days passed in the Whitmore house, filled with small rituals that Elena was slowly learning to read like a second language. Breakfast at 8, always in the smaller dining room, never the grand one reserved for guests. Afternoon calls that Margaret took in her study with the door half closed, her voice dropping into the careful, measured tone she used for people she needed something from. Evening walks that Edward Whitmore took alone through the gardens, a habit no one questioned, and everyone quietly respected. Elena filled her days with small, unremarkable tasks. She helped the housekeeper organize the linen closets, though she did it so efficiently that the older woman began asking her opinion on other matters as well. She sat with Nathaniel in the evenings while he reviewed contracts, offering the occasional comment that always sounded more like a question than a correction, though Nathaniel had begun to notice that her questions had a habit of pointing directly at whatever flaw a document contained. "You have a good eye," he told her one night, after she had asked, almost shyly, whether a particular clause in a supplier agreement seemed unusually favorable to the supplier. "I just noticed things," Alina said, and turned the page of the magazine she had been pretending to read. It was during these quiet evenings that Alina began to understand the true shape of the Whitmore family, not through what they told her directly, but through the conversations they thought she could not fully follow. Margaret and Claire had a habit, when they believed themselves alone, of slipping into Spanish, a language Margaret had picked up decades earlier during a long stretch of business dealings in South America, and had passed on, imperfectly but proudly, to her daughter. They used it the way some families use a locked drawer, a place to keep things they did not want others to see. The first time Alina heard them do it, she had been sitting quietly in the corner of the sitting room, a book open in her lap that she was not really reading, while Margaret and Claire discussed the seating arrangements for the upcoming investor dinner. Their conversation shifted smoothly from English to Spanish the moment the topic turned to Alina herself, as though a door had quietly closed between the three of them. "Do you think she will embarrass us again?" Claire said in Spanish, not bothering to lower her voice because she assumed there was no need. "I hope not," Margaret answered also in Spanish. "Though I am beginning to wonder if Nathaniel married her simply because she is easy to manage. She agrees with everything. She asks for nothing. It is almost unsettling." "Maybe she really is just simple," Claire said. "Pretty and simple, some men prefer that." Alina kept her eyes on her book, her expression unchanged, though inside something cool and steady settled into place, the same feeling she used to get in university lecture halls when a professor made an assumption about her that she knew, with complete certainty, was wrong. She did not look up. She did not react. She simply turned a page she had not actually read and let the conversation wash over her, filing away every word. She understood, in that moment, something important about the family she had married into. They did not see her as a person with her own history, her own education, her own reasons for being exactly who she was. They saw her as a variable to be solved, a small complication in the otherwise orderly equation of the Whitmore family's future. And variables, Alina knew from long experience, were easy to underestimate right up until the moment they changed the entire outcome of the problem. Nathaniel, for his part, remained blissfully unaware of the quiet war being waged around his wife. He adored Alina with the straightforward, uncomplicated love of a man who had never had to fight for anything in his life, and had therefore never learned to notice when someone he loved was fighting silently beside him. He spent his days managing a growing list of responsibilities at the family company, preparing to eventually take over from his father, and his evenings talking to Alina about everything, except the things his mother and sister said when he was not in the room. "My mother will come around," he told her one night, echoing the same promise he had made before. "She just needs time to see how happy you make me." "I believe you," Alina said, and meant it, though not quite in the way he intended. She did believe his mother would come around eventually, though she suspected it would not happen through patience alone. 3 days before the investor dinner, Alina found herself alone in the study with Edward Whitmore, who had asked her to help him organize a stack of old family photographs for an anniversary album he was planning as a surprise for Margaret. It was a task far outside the scope of anything Margaret or Claire had assigned her, and Alina suspected Edward had chosen her specifically because he trusted her more than he let on, or perhaps simply because he was lonelier in this house than anyone realized. "You remind me of my mother," Edward said, sorting through a pile of black and white photographs with careful hands. "She came from very little, worked twice as hard as anyone else in every room she ever walked into just to be taken half as seriously. People underestimated her constantly. It infuriated my father watching them do it, though he always said the same thing." "What did he say?" Alina asked. "He said, let them underestimate her. It will be their mistake to fix, not ours." Edward smiled at the memory, a small, private smile that softened the tired lines around his eyes. "She built half of this family's fortune from behind the scenes, while everyone else believed my father was doing it alone. It was only after she passed that people finally understood how much of it had been her." Elena said nothing for a long moment, holding a photograph of a young woman standing in front of what looked like a much smaller version of the Whitmore estate. Her chin lifted with quiet confidence despite the plainness of her dress. "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know." "She would have liked you," Edward said, glancing up at her with something thoughtful in his expression. "More than you might think." It was the closest anyone in the family had come to seeing her clearly, and Elena tucked the moment away carefully, the way she tucked away everything that mattered. The night before the investor dinner, Margaret called a small family meeting in the sitting room to go over the details one final time. William stood near the doorway, as he always did during these meetings, present but unnoticed, the way good staff learn to be. "The Ashford family will be joining us," Margaret said, referring to a list she held in one hand. "Daniel Ashford and his daughter Grace. They represent one of the largest investment groups on the East Coast, and if this merger goes through, it will secure this family's position for the next generation. I cannot stress enough how important tomorrow night is." "I have read the merger documents," Nathaniel said. "The numbers look solid." "They had better be," Margaret said, "because if anything goes wrong tomorrow, it will not just be an embarrassment, it will cost us the deal entirely." Her eyes moved briefly to Elena, sitting quietly beside Nathaniel with her hands folded in her lap, and something in her expression suggested she was including Elena in that warning, whether or not she said so directly. "I understand," Elena said softly. "I will be on my best behavior." "See that you are," Margaret said, and turned back to her notes, missing entirely the flicker of something sharp and amused that crossed Elena's face for just a fraction of a second before disappearing again behind her usual polite calm. Later, as the family began drifting toward their rooms for the night, Claire lingered in the hallway outside Elena's door, catching her alone for a rare moment. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said, and for once her tone carried less of its usual edge. "Of course," Elena said. "Are you happy here?" Claire asked. "Really happy?" "Because sometimes I look at you, and I cannot tell if you actually love my brother, or if you are just very good at pretending." The question landed with more weight than Claire probably intended, and for a moment, Elena considered answering it fully and honestly, letting down her guard just slightly with the one member of this family who occasionally seemed capable of real curiosity rather than pure suspicion. But she had learned, over many years and many rooms much colder than this one, that trust was something to be earned in small, careful steps, not given away simply because someone finally asked the right question. "I love your brother very much," Elena said, and it was at least entirely true. "As for the rest, I think you will understand better with time." Claire studied her for a moment, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to push further, and finally nodded and disappeared down the hallway toward her own room. Elena closed her door behind her and sat down at the small desk near the window, pulling out her phone to review, one final time, the merger documents Nathaniel had mentioned earlier. She had asked him casually if she could look them over, framing it as simple curiosity about his work, and he had agreed without a second thought, pleased that she was taking an interest. What Nathaniel did not know, what none of the Whitmores knew, was that Elena had spent the last 3 evenings quietly cross-referencing every figure in that merger agreement against public financial records, market trends, and the kind of detailed regulatory filings that most people never bothered to read, because they were long and dense and written in language, designed to discourage exactly that kind of scrutiny. Elena had spent 3 years of her professional life doing precisely this sort of work, finding the small inconsistencies buried inside large, complicated deals, the kind of errors that looked like nothing until they became everything. She had found something. She was not yet certain what it meant, or how deep it went, but there was a discrepancy in the numbers tied to the Ashford investment that did not add up cleanly, a figure that had been adjusted somewhere between one filing and the next without any clear explanation. It could have been nothing, a simple accounting correction lost in translation between departments, or it could have been something else entirely. She closed the document and set her phone aside, staring out the window at the dark shapes of the garden below, thinking about her mother-in-law's warning, about Claire's question, about Edward's story of his own mother building an empire from the shadows while everyone else took the credit in the light. Tomorrow night, at a dinner meant to secure the family's future, Heir'S intended to finally stop being quiet. Not because she had decided to reveal everything at once, not yet, but because something inside her, some old and familiar instinct sharpened by years of being underestimated, told her that the discrepancy she had found was not a small thing at all, and that someone at that table tomorrow night already knew exactly what it meant. She just did not yet know who. Heir'S had not always been the quiet woman sitting at the edge of the Whitmore family's grand dining table, and to understand why she was capable of holding her silence so completely, it helped to understand where that silence had first been learned. She had grown up in a small house on the edge of a city that never quite decided whether it belonged to one country or two, raised by a mother who had come from Bogotá with almost nothing and a father whose family had lived in the same quiet American suburb for 3 generations. Her parents met at a community college night class, her father studying accounting because it was practical, her mother studying English because she refused to let a new country decide what she was capable of learning. They fell in love somewhere between verb conjugations and tax law, and Alina had always thought there was something fitting about that, 2 very different languages of precision finding a way to understand each other. From her mother, Alina inherited 2 languages spoken with equal fluency, a habit of watching people closely before deciding whether to trust them, and an unshakable belief that being underestimated was not a wound but a weapon, if a person knew how to use it properly. From her father, she inherited a mind that found comfort in numbers, in the clean, unarguable logic of a balance sheet, in the particular satisfaction of finding the one figure in 100 pages that did not belong. As a child, Alina had often sat beside her mother at the kitchen table, while her mother reviewed invoices for the small cleaning business she eventually built from nothing, watching her mother's pen move quickly down each column, catching errors that the larger companies sending those invoices clearly assumed no one would notice. "They think because I clean their offices I cannot read their numbers," her mother told her once, not with anger, but with the calm amusement of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by other people's assumptions. "It is a useful mistake for them to make. I let them keep making it." Alina had carried that lesson with her through every stage of her life. She carried it through high school, where teachers occasionally suggested, gently but persistently, that perhaps advanced mathematics was not the best use of her time, only to watch her outscore every other student in the class by the end of the term. She carried it through her undergraduate years, split between a university in Bogotá, where her mother's family still lived, and a smaller college back home, where professors in finance courses sometimes seemed surprised when the quiet young woman in the back row asked the sharpest questions in the room. She carried it into her first job at an investment firm, where a senior partner once introduced her to a room full of clients as "our junior assistant. She mostly just organizes files," despite the fact that Alina had spent the previous 3 weeks quietly restructuring the very deal being discussed in that meeting. She had not corrected him in front of the clients. She had simply waited until the meeting was over, presented her full analysis in writing, and let the results speak in a way that no introduction ever could. Within a year, she was no longer introduced as an assistant. Within 3 years, she was the person other analysts came to when a deal did not feel right and they could not explain exactly why. It was at a charity dinner, organized by one of the firm's larger clients, that she had first met Nathaniel Whitmore. He had, true to the story she told at the Whitmore family table, spilled a glass of red wine directly onto the front of her dress while reaching across the table for a bread basket, and had spent the following 10 minutes apologizing with such genuine, flustered embarrassment that Alina found herself laughing before he had even finished his second apology. "You do not need to apologize a 3rd time," she had told him, dabbing at the stain with a napkin. "The dress survived worse conversations than this one." "I feel like I should at least offer to buy you a new one," Nathaniel had said, still red in the face. "Buy me a coffee instead," Alina had said. "Much less expensive, and I think it will make you feel better faster." That had been the beginning of it, a courtship built on easy laughter and long conversations that stretched late into the night. Conversations in which Nathaniel spoke openly about the pressures of his family's business and the expectations that came with his last name. And Alina listened carefully, the way she listened to everyone, gathering information without ever seeming to gather anything at all. She had fallen in love with him slowly and completely, drawn to his warmth, his genuine kindness, the way he treated the waitstaff at every restaurant with the same respect he showed his business partners. A small detail that told her more about his character than any of his family's money ever could. But even as she fell in love, some careful part of her mind, the part shaped by a childhood spent watching her mother navigate rooms that assumed the worst of her, had quietly begun preparing for the family she would eventually have to face. Nathaniel had warned her in his own way, though perhaps not clearly enough. "My mother can be difficult," he had told her once, early in their relationship. "She's protective of the family name. It comes across as cold sometimes, but she means well underneath it." Alina had nodded and said she understood, and in a way she had, though understanding a warning and experiencing its full weight in person were two very different things. She had walked into the Whitmore estate for the first time prepared for coldness, prepared for careful questions designed to test her worthiness, prepared even for outright disapproval. What she had not fully anticipated was the particular flavor of dismissal she encountered instead, a kind of polite, smiling condescension that assumed she was not worth the effort of real hostility because she was not perceived as a real threat. It had stung in the beginning, more than she let herself admit even to herself. There was a particular loneliness in being underestimated by people who were supposed to become your family, in sitting at a table full of people who spoke about your intelligence, your background, your very presence in their lives as though you could not hear them, or as though your feelings simply did not carry the same weight as theirs. But loneliness, Alina had learned long ago, was a temporary condition, while patience, properly applied, produced results that lasted. She thought often of her mother's invoices, of the pen moving steadily down each column, catching every error the larger companies assumed would slip past unnoticed. She thought of her own early years at the investment firm, of the senior partner who had once called her an assistant to a room full of clients, and of the quiet satisfaction of proving him wrong not through argument, but through undeniable results. She had decided, somewhere in her first few weeks in the Whitmore house, that she would apply the same strategy here. She would let them see whatever version of her made them comfortable. She would nod along to Margaret's careful tests and Claire's sharp little comments. She would answer every question slowly and simply, allowing the small gap in her spoken English, a habit left over from years of code switching between languages, to be misread as a limitation rather than what it actually was, a careful person choosing her words with precision. And in the meantime, she would watch. She would listen. She would learn the family's habits, their weaknesses, the places where their careful public image did not quite match the private reality underneath it. She had done it before, in boardrooms far more intimidating than this one, and she intended to do it again now, for reasons that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with survival, and eventually, with genuine respect, if the family ever proved capable of earning it. The discrepancy she had discovered in the Ashford merger documents fit into this pattern in a way that felt, to Alina, almost too neat to be coincidence. She had spent the days leading up to the investor dinner running the numbers again and again, checking her own work the way she had been trained to do at the investment firm, refusing to trust a single conclusion until she had tested it from every possible angle. The discrepancy centered on a valuation figure tied to a smaller company the Ashford Group had recently acquired, a company whose assets were being folded into the larger merger calculations in a way that inflated the overall deal's projected value by a margin that seemed, at first glance, almost too small to matter. Almost. Alina had learned, over years of studying exactly this kind of document, that the deals which caused the most damage were rarely the ones with obvious, glaring errors. Those were caught quickly, corrected, forgotten. The dangerous deals were the ones with small, careful inconsistencies, buried deep enough that only someone looking for them would ever find them. Adjustments made by someone who understood precisely how much room existed between careless mistake and deliberate manipulation. She did not yet know which one this was. She did not know if the discrepancy originated with the Ashford family, with someone inside the Whitmore company, or with some administrative error so mundane it would embarrass everyone involved once discovered. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who had built an entire career on trusting exactly this kind of instinct, that something about this deal was not what it appeared to be on the surface. On the morning of the investor dinner, Alina rose early again, as she always did, and found herself once more alone in the kitchen with her coffee, watching the sun rise slowly over the gardens. She thought about the conversation she had overheard between Margaret and Claire, spoken in Spanish under the assumption that she could not follow it. She thought about Edward's story of his own mother, building an empire quietly while everyone else took credit in the light. She thought about her own mother's pen, moving steadily down each column of numbers, catching what others assumed would go unnoticed. Tonight, she decided, she would still be quiet. She would still smile politely and speak carefully, and let the Whitmore family believe, for a few more hours, that they understood exactly who she was. But somewhere in the course of the evening, depending on what she learned, depending on how deep this discrepancy actually ran, and who exactly was responsible for it, she suspected that quiet might not be an option for much longer. She finished her coffee, dressed carefully for the day ahead, and went to find Nathaniel, already rehearsing in her mind the careful, simple questions she would ask him about the merger. Questions designed to sound like harmless curiosity, while gathering exactly the information she needed before the sun went down, and the Ashford family arrived at the Whitmore estate for what everyone else in the house believed would be an ordinary, if important, business dinner. Alina Reyes knew better. She had learned long ago that the most important dinners were rarely the ones that looked important from the outside. They were the ones where something quietly shifted beneath the surface, invisible to everyone at the table except the one person who had spent her entire life learning exactly how to watch for it. By the time the afternoon sun began slanting long and gold across the Whitmore estate, the house had transformed into something closer to a stage set than a home. Florists arranged tall white blooms along the entrance hall. A team of caterers moved through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 100 times before. Margaret moved through every room like a general inspecting troops, adjusting a centerpiece here, correcting a place setting there, her sharp eyes catching every detail that might, in her mind, reflect poorly on the family. Alina spent the afternoon dressing carefully, choosing a deep blue gown that Nathaniel had bought for her weeks earlier and that she had been saving for an occasion that mattered. She styled her hair the way her mother had taught her, simple but elegant, and stood for a long moment in front of the mirror, studying her own reflection with the same careful attention she gave to a page of financial figures. She did not look, she thought, like someone easily dismissed. But she knew from experience that appearance rarely changed the assumptions people had already decided to make. "You look beautiful," Nathaniel said, appearing in the doorway of their room, adjusting his own tie with the slightly distracted energy of a man trying to remember a dozen things at once. "Thank you," Alina said. "Are you nervous?" "A little," he admitted. "This deal matters more than most. If it goes well, my father is talking about handing over full control of the Eastern Division to me by the end of the year. And if it does not go well?" Nathaniel's smile faltered slightly. "Let's not think about that tonight." Alina crossed the room and straightened his tie for him, her fingers moving with quiet precision. "It will be fine," she said, and meant it, though not necessarily in the way he assumed. Whatever happened at dinner tonight, whatever she discovered about the discrepancy she had found in the merger documents, she intended to make sure that Nathaniel walked away from this evening in a stronger position than he started it, even if the path to get there was not the one either of them expected. They came downstairs together just as the first guests began arriving. Daniel Ashford was a broad, silver-haired man with the easy, practiced charm of someone who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one, closing deals with a handshake and a joke before the paperwork ever hit the table. His daughter, Grace, walked beside him, sharp-eyed and composed in a dress the color of dark wine, clearly cut from a similar cloth as her father but with a colder, more calculating edge beneath the surface politeness. "Nathaniel, good to see you," Daniel said, shaking his hand warmly. "And this must be the new bride we've heard so much about." "Elena," Nathaniel said, drawing her forward. "My wife." "Charmed," Daniel said, taking Elena's hand and offering the kind of smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Margaret tells us you're settling in beautifully." "I am learning a great deal," Elena said, offering her usual careful, simple smile. Grace Ashford studied her for a moment longer than politeness required, her expression unreadable. "I imagine there is a lot to learn, coming into a family like this one," she said. "It must feel very different from wherever you came from." "Different in some ways," Elena said, "familiar in others." If Grace found the answer unsatisfying, she did not press further, instead turning her attention to Margaret, who had appeared beside them with the seamless timing of a woman who had spent her entire life managing rooms exactly like this one. The group moved into the sitting room for drinks before dinner, and Elena found herself, as she often did at these gatherings, positioned slightly at the edge of the main conversation, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be easily forgotten. She did not mind. It was, in many ways, exactly where she preferred to be. It was during this pre-dinner gathering that the first true test of the evening arrived, though it came disguised as something far more casual. Margaret and Claire had drifted toward a quiet corner of the room, ostensibly discussing the seating arrangement for dinner, though their conversation, once again, slid smoothly into Spanish the moment it turned toward Elena. "She looks nervous," Claire said, watching Elena from across the room, her voice low but not nearly low enough. "She always looks like that," Margaret answered. "Like a child waiting to be told she has done something wrong. I do not know how Nathaniel finds that charming." "Do you think she understands anything about tonight?" Claire asked. "The actual deal, I mean. Or is she just here to look pretty and nod at the right moments?" "I would be very surprised if she followed even half of what is discussed at that table," Margaret said, with the particular confidence of someone who had already decided the answer before asking the question. "Which, honestly, might work in our favor. The less she says, the less chance she has of embarrassing this family in front of the Ashfords." Elena, standing near the window with a glass of sparkling water in hand, kept her expression perfectly neutral, though something inside her tightened, not from hurt exactly, but from the particular, familiar frustration of watching people so confidently wrong about something so easily proven otherwise. She thought again of her mother's invoices, of the pen moving steadily down each column, and reminded herself, as she always did, that the moment for correction had not yet arrived. Not yet, but soon. William moved through the room with a tray of drinks, pausing near Elena for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "Everything is fine, William," Elena said, offering him a small, genuine smile, the kind she rarely showed the rest of the family. "Thank you for asking." William nodded and moved on, and Elena found herself wondering, not for the first time, exactly how much the quiet butler noticed about this house and everyone in it. More than anyone gave him credit for, she suspected. Perhaps they had more in common than either of them had ever openly discussed. As the group finally moved toward the dining room, Elena caught a brief, unexpected moment alone with Edward Whitmore in the hallway, the rest of the party having already drifted ahead of them. "You seem quieter than usual tonight," Edward said, his tone gentle, almost fatherly in a way that caught Elena slightly off guard. "Big dinner," Elena said. "I am simply focused." Edward studied her for a moment, and something in his expression suggested he understood more than he let on, the same quiet perceptiveness she had noticed in him during their afternoon sorting through old photographs. "You know," he said slowly, My mother used to say that the quietest person at the table is usually the one who ends up controlling the entire conversation, once she finally decides to speak. I always thought that was just a nice thing to say about a woman who felt overlooked. It took me a long time to realize she meant it literally. Elena said nothing, but something in her chest loosened slightly. A small, unexpected comfort in the idea that at least one person in this house saw her more clearly than the rest. "I hope tonight goes well for Nathaniel," she said finally. "I hope it goes well for both of you," Edward said, and offered her his arm to walk the rest of the way into the dining room, a small, old-fashioned gesture that Elena appreciated more than she expected to. The dining room had been transformed for the occasion, the long table set with the family's finest china, tall candles casting warm light across crystal glasses, and carefully arranged flowers. Daniel Ashford took his seat near the head of the table, close to Edward, while Grace settled in beside Margaret, the two women falling easily into a conversation about a mutual acquaintance's recent renovation project. Nathaniel and Elena took their places near the middle of the table, close enough to follow the main conversation, far enough to remain slightly outside its center. As the first course was served, the conversation turned, gradually and inevitably, toward the merger itself. "I have to say," Daniel Ashford said, swirling the wine in his glass, "the numbers on this deal look better than I expected. Your team did solid work putting the projections together." "We had a good group on it," Edward said. "Nathaniel oversaw most of the final details personally." "Impressive," Daniel said, nodding toward Nathaniel with genuine respect. "Your father tells me you have a sharp eye for this sort of thing." "I try," Nathaniel said. "Though I'll admit, some of the smaller companies folded into the valuation took a bit more digging than I expected. There were a few figures that didn't line up cleanly at first glance." Elena's attention sharpened instantly, though her expression remained carefully unchanged. This was it, she realized, the exact thread she had been quietly pulling at for the past several days, now surfacing on its own in the middle of dinner conversation. "Which figures were those?" she asked, her voice soft, careful, the same slow, deliberate tone she always used at this table, though underneath it, every part of her mind had suddenly focused with absolute clarity. The table paused for the briefest moment, several sets of eyes turning toward her with mild surprise, as though a piece of furniture had unexpectedly spoken. "Nothing you need to worry about, dear," Margaret said smoothly, before Nathaniel could answer, her tone light but final, the kind of interruption meant to close a door before it had fully opened. "Business matters. Rather dull for the rest of us." "Of course," Elena said, and lowered her eyes back to her plate, offering no resistance, no argument, exactly the reaction the room expected of her. But beneath the table, her hand tightened briefly around the edge of her napkin, and her mind continued working exactly as it had been working for the past several days, quietly, carefully, assembling the pieces of a puzzle that no one else at this table yet realized she was capable of solving. Grace Ashford, Elena noticed, had gone very slightly still at the mention of the smaller companies folded into the valuation, her expression carefully composed but her eyes flicking, just for a moment, toward her father before settling back into polite neutrality. It was a small thing, the kind of reaction most people would have missed entirely. Elena did not miss it. Somewhere between the first course and the second, as the conversation drifted back toward safer, more comfortable topics, Elena found herself certain of one thing above all others. The discrepancy she had found in the merger documents was not an accident, and at least one person seated at this very table already knew exactly why it was there. She smiled softly, said very little, and continued to watch, waiting for the right moment, the moment she had been quietly preparing for since the first night Margaret Whitmore had looked at her across this very table and decided, with complete confidence, that she understood exactly who Elena Heir'S was. That moment, Elena knew now, was coming faster than any of them expected. The second course arrived on white china rimmed in gold, and with it came a new round of conversation that circled, once again, closer to the heart of the deal everyone at the table had gathered to secure. Daniel Ashford leaned back in his chair, the easy confidence of a man who had negotiated 100 deals like this one settling comfortably around him like a well-worn coat. "Let's talk numbers properly," he said, setting down his fork. "I want to walk through the final valuation figures before we shake hands on anything tonight. No surprises later, that's always been my rule." "A wise rule," Edward said. "Nathaniel, why don't you walk Daniel through the summary?" Nathaniel nodded, pulling a small folder from beside his chair, the same folder Alina had glanced through days earlier without his knowledge. He opened it to the summary page and began speaking with the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment many times over the past week. "The core company valuation comes in at just under $400 million, he said. "That includes the recent acquisition of the smaller logistics firm your group picked up last spring, which we folded into the overall figure based on projected synergies." "And that acquisition adds how much to the total?" Daniel asked. "Around $22 million, Nathaniel said, glancing briefly at his notes. "Which aligns with the figures your team sent over last month." Alina, seated quietly beside him, felt something settle into place with the same quiet click of certainty she used to feel back at the investment firm whenever a piece of a difficult puzzle finally locked into position. 22 million. That was the number written in the most recent filing Nathaniel had shown her. But the earlier filing, the one from several weeks prior, the one Alina had cross-referenced against public records during her long evenings of quiet research, had listed the same acquisition at a very different figure. 18 million, not 22. A difference of $4 million, quietly folded into the deal somewhere between one filing and the next, dressed up in language about projected synergies that sounded reasonable enough to pass without question, unless someone happened to be looking closely enough to notice the gap. Alina kept her expression perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, though her mind moved quickly now, running through every possible explanation. It could have been a legitimate revaluation, she told herself, a genuine reassessment of the logistics firm's worth based on new information. Companies were reappraised constantly for all kinds of reasonable reasons. But $4 million was not a small adjustment, and the timing, so close to the final merger discussions, struck her as far too convenient to dismiss without further thought. She glanced, briefly and carefully, toward Grace Ashford, who had gone quiet during this exchange, her wine glass held loosely in one hand, her attention seemingly fixed on her plate. It was the same careful stillness Alina had noticed earlier, the posture of someone working very hard to appear uninterested in a conversation that mattered to her a great deal. "The numbers look solid to me," Daniel said, nodding with satisfaction. "Edward, your son has done good work here." "He takes after his mother in that regard," Edward said, smiling toward Margaret, who accepted the compliment with a small, gracious tilt of her head. "And what does the new addition to the family think of all this?" Daniel asked, turning his attention, somewhat unexpectedly, toward Alina. "You've been very quiet, my dear. Business not to your taste." The table's attention shifted toward her, and for a brief moment, Alina felt the full weight of every assumption gathered around this table settle onto her shoulders at once. She could feel Margaret's eyes on her, sharp and expectant, already anticipating the same soft, simple, forgettable answer Alina had given at every dinner before this one. "I find it very interesting," Alina said carefully, choosing the safest possible response. "Though I understand it is complicated, I am still learning." "Of course," Daniel said kindly, already losing interest, his attention drifting back toward Edward and the next item on the evening's agenda. Margaret, however, was not quite finished. She leaned toward Claire, lowering her voice into the familiar shelter of Spanish, though this time something in her tone carried a sharper edge than usual, perhaps emboldened by the wine, or by the satisfaction of watching Alina fumble through yet another moment at this table. "She really has nothing to offer at these dinners," Margaret said quietly in Spanish to Claire. "Decoration, that is all she is good for." a pretty face at the end of the table who nods and smiles and says nothing of substance. I suppose every family needs one. Claire, perhaps sensing that her mother had gone slightly further than usual, glanced briefly toward Elena, a small flicker of discomfort crossing her face before she covered it with a soft laugh. At least she is a nice decoration, Claire said, also in Spanish, though her voice carried noticeably less conviction than her mother's. Elena, sitting perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, felt the words land the way stones land in still water, a small, cold shock that spread outward through her chest before settling into something else entirely, something calm and clear and absolutely certain. She thought of her mother's pen moving down the columns of those invoices, catching every error the larger companies assumed would slip past unnoticed. She thought of the senior partner introducing her to a room full of clients as nothing more than an assistant who organized files, and the quiet satisfaction, a year later, of never being introduced that way again. She thought of every room she had ever sat in, underestimated, dismissed, spoken about rather than spoken to, and the particular, hard-won patience it had taken to sit quietly through every single one of them, waiting for exactly the right moment to stop. She looked very briefly at Nathaniel, who was deep in conversation with Daniel Ashford about a detail in the contract's timeline, entirely unaware of what his mother had just said about his wife in a language he did not speak. She looked at Edward, who was watching the exchange between his wife and daughter with a faint, unreadable expression, as though something about their tone, if not their words, had caught his attention. She looked finally at Grace Ashford, who was still very carefully not looking at anyone at all, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around the stem of her wine glass. The $4 million discrepancy. Margaret's careless remark, spoken in a language she assumed no one at this end of the table could understand. Grace Ashford's stiff, deliberate silence at exactly the moments when the acquisition numbers came up. 3 separate threads, and Elena, sitting quietly at the edge of the table where she had been placed and largely forgotten, suddenly understood, with the same clean, absolute certainty she felt whenever a difficult financial puzzle finally resolved itself, that all 3 threads led to the exact same place. The dinner continued around her, the conversation moving on to lighter topics, the arrival of the main course, a brief, warm story from Daniel Ashford about a fishing trip gone wrong that drew genuine laughter from everyone at the table. Elena laughed along at the appropriate moments, offered a small, polite comment here and there, and gave absolutely no indication that anything unusual had happened, that anything at all had shifted in the quiet architecture of her understanding. But inside, she was no longer the woman who had walked into this dining room an hour earlier. She was assembling, piece by careful piece, exactly what she intended to say, and precisely how she intended to say it, when the moment finally arrived to stop being quiet. She thought of Edward's words from their afternoon in the study, the story of his own mother building an empire from behind the scenes, while everyone else took the credit in the light. She thought of William's quiet, unspoken understanding, the small kindness of a man who noticed far more than anyone gave him credit for. She thought, most of all, of her own mother, crossing an ocean with 2 suitcases, and a determination that had never once bent under the weight of anyone else's doubt. Margaret Whitmore believed she was sitting across the table from a decoration, a pretty, harmless addition to the family, with nothing of substance to offer. Elena allowed her to keep believing it for a few minutes longer, savoring the strange, sharp calm that settled over her whenever she found herself standing at the edge of exactly this kind of moment, the moment just before everything changed. The dessert course arrived, a delicate arrangement of chocolate and fresh berries that drew appreciative murmurs from around the table. Daniel Ashford refilled his wine glass and leaned back with the satisfied air of a man who believed the evening's business had already been settled in his favor. "Well," he said, raising his glass toward Edward and Nathaniel, "I think we can call this a successful evening. Shall we finalize the numbers and move forward with the signing next week?" "I think that sounds wonderful," Margaret said warmly, lifting her own glass to join the toast, her earlier comment about Elena already forgotten, tucked away in the private language she believed had kept it safely hidden from everyone who mattered. Elena Reyes set down her fork, folded her hands calmly in her lap, and lifted her eyes to look directly across the table at her mother-in-law. "Before we finalize anything," she said, her voice clear and steady and entirely without hesitation, "I think there is something about the numbers we should discuss." The words came out in English, simple and unremarkable on the surface, but something in the tone Elena used, a new sharpness that had not been there in any of her careful, hesitant answers throughout the entire evening, made the table fall quiet almost instantly, every head turning toward her with the same slow, dawning surprise of people watching something familiar suddenly reveal itself to be entirely different than they had assumed. Margaret's smile faltered just slightly, though she recovered quickly. "I am sure it can wait until after dessert, dear," she said, her tone light, though something beneath it had gone tight and cautious. "I do not think it can," Elena said, and then, turning her attention fully toward Margaret, she continued, this time in Spanish, her words fluent and unhurried and perfectly clear, carrying across the table with the particular, devastating calm of someone who has finally decided to stop pretending. The table went absolutely silent. "You said a few minutes ago that I am nothing more than decoration at this table," Elena said, still in Spanish, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily across the sudden silence that had fallen over the dining room. "That I have nothing of substance to offer. I want you to know that I heard every word." Margaret's face had gone very pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with the particular shock of someone watching a carefully constructed assumption collapse in real time. Claire sat equally still beside her, her mouth slightly open, the color draining from her cheeks as she replayed, with obvious horror, every comment she had ever made in this language, believing it safe from Elena's understanding. "You speak Spanish," Margaret said finally, the words coming out slow and stunned, as though she were still trying to process a fact that refused to fit inside the version of Elena she had built in her mind over the past 6 weeks. "I have spoken it fluently since I was a child," Elena said, switching back to English now, her voice steady, addressing the whole table rather than just Margaret. "My mother is from Colombia. I grew up speaking both languages equally. I have understood every conversation held in this house in either language since the day I arrived." Nathaniel turned to look at his wife with an expression caught somewhere between shock and something that was slowly, unmistakably, beginning to shift into pride. "Elena," he said quietly, "you never told me." "You never asked," Elena said gently, and there was no cruelty in the words, only simple truth. "And I did not think it would matter, until it started to." Daniel Ashford, watching the exchange unfold with the sharp attention of a man who had spent his career reading rooms for exactly this kind of shift, set down his own wine glass slowly. "I think," he said carefully, "that we may have misjudged something here." "Perhaps," Elena said, turning her attention toward him now, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly, taking on the crisp, precise cadence of someone stepping into professional territory she knew intimately well. "Which brings me to the matter I wanted to discuss before we finalize anything tonight." She reached for the small clutch purse resting beside her chair and withdrew a folded piece of paper, setting it carefully on the table beside her plate, though she did not yet open it. Nathaniel mentioned earlier that the logistics firm acquired by the Ashford Group last spring added approximately $22 million to the overall merger valuation, Elena said. "I would like to ask about that figure." "What about it?" Daniel asked, his easy charm from earlier in the evening now noticeably absent, replaced by something more guarded. "The filing submitted 6 weeks ago listed that same acquisition at $18 million, Elena said. "I would be very interested to understand what changed in the past month to justify a $4 million increase in valuation, especially so close to the final signing." The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before it, heavier, more charged, the particular silence of a room in which everyone present had suddenly realized that the evening's real business had only just begun. "That figure was adjusted based on updated projections," Daniel said, recovering some of his earlier composure, though his voice carried a new, careful stiffness. These things happen constantly in deals of this size. Markets shift. Projections get revised. They do, Alina agreed pleasantly. Though typically, a revision of that size would come with supporting documentation, an updated appraisal, something to explain the change. I looked quite thoroughly, and I could not find any such documentation attached to the most recent filing. Edward Whitmore, who had remained largely quiet through the initial shock of Alina's revelation, now leaned forward slightly, his sharp business instincts clearly overriding his surprise. "Is this true, Daniel?" "I would need to check with my team," Daniel said, though something in his tone suggested he already knew exactly what the answer would be. Grace Ashford, who had gone very still during this entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual, carrying an edge that had not been there earlier in the evening. "Father, I think we should discuss this privately." "Grace," Daniel said, a warning note entering his voice. "No," Grace said, and something in her expression suggested a decision being made in real time, a choice between loyalty to her father and something else entirely. "I think it needs to be said now. The valuation was adjusted at my recommendation." The table turned toward her, and Alina, watching carefully, saw the same flicker of tension she had noticed earlier in the evening, now fully surfacing into the open. "Grace," Daniel said again, more sharply this time. "I made a mistake," Grace continued, ignoring her father's tone, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her rather than meeting anyone else's gaze directly. "The logistics firm's numbers were weaker than we initially presented. I adjusted the figure hoping it would even out once the deal closed, that the synergies would eventually justify the gap. It was not honest, and I should not have done it." "Grace," Daniel said a third time, quieter now, something like disappointment mixing with what sounded almost like relief, the particular relief of a man who had perhaps known something was wrong, and had chosen not to look too closely at it himself. Nathaniel, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke, his voice steady despite the clear shock still evident on his face. "If this figure is wrong, we need to know the full extent of it before anyone signs anything." "Agreed," Edward said firmly, all traces of the earlier celebratory mood gone entirely from his voice. "Daniel, I think we need to postpone the signing until this can be properly reviewed." Daniel Ashford nodded slowly, the confident ease he had carried into the dining room earlier in the evening now replaced by something far more subdued. "Of course," he said. "I apologize for the oversight. It seems my daughter, and I have some matters to discuss before we move forward." Grace, still not quite meeting anyone's eyes, gave a small, tight nod, though something in her posture suggested a peculiar kind of relief as well. The release of a burden she had perhaps been carrying alone for longer than anyone at this table realized. Margaret Whitmore, throughout this entire exchange, had said almost nothing, sitting frozen in her seat with an expression that shifted, moment by moment, from shock to something closer to dawning, uncomfortable comprehension. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all of its earlier sharpness, replaced by something quieter and far more uncertain. "How long have you known?" she asked, looking at Alina directly for the first time since the revelation had begun. "About the discrepancy in the numbers a few days," Alina said. "About the fact that I understand Spanish since the moment I walked into this house." Margaret absorbed this slowly, her eyes moving briefly toward Claire, who looked as though she wished very much to disappear into the floor beneath her chair. "Then you heard everything," Margaret said. "Every conversation." "Every conversation," Alina confirmed, though her tone carried no triumph in it, only a calm, steady honesty. "I did not enjoy hearing most of it if that is what you are asking. But I understood, very early on, that this family was going to decide for itself who I was, regardless of what I actually said or did. I decided it would be more useful to let you finish deciding before I corrected you." "That seems," Margaret said slowly, "like a very deliberate choice." "It was," Alina said simply. For a long moment, no one at the table spoke. William, standing quietly near the doorway as he had throughout the entire dinner, allowed himself the smallest, most private smile, quickly hidden as he stepped forward to begin clearing the dessert plates, giving the family a moment to absorb everything that had just unfolded in front of them. Nathaniel reached over and took Alina's hand under the table, the same small gesture he had offered her weeks earlier during her very first uncomfortable dinner in this house, though this time it carried an entirely different weight, no longer an attempt at quiet reassurance, but something closer to open admiration. "I think," he said, looking around the table at his stunned family, "that my wife just saved this entire deal from becoming a very expensive mistake." "It would seem so," Edward said, and though his voice carried the careful measure of a man still processing the events of the past several minutes, something in his expression, as he looked at Alina, had shifted into open respect. Daniel Ashford, recovering some of his composure, extended a hand across the table toward Alina, a gesture that felt, in the context of everything that had just happened, far more significant than a simple handshake. "It seems," he said, "that I owe you a proper introduction. I clearly did not understand who I was speaking with earlier this evening." "Alina Heir'S," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I spent 3 years as a financial analyst before I met your family. I still am one, though I suppose that fact was not entirely obvious until tonight." "Clearly not," Daniel said, and for the first time since dinner began, something like genuine, unguarded respect crossed his features. Margaret Whitmore sat very still throughout this exchange, watching the woman she had spent 6 weeks quietly dismissing now command the full attention and respect of everyone at the table, including her own husband and son. Something in her expression suggested the slow, uncomfortable process of rebuilding an entire understanding from the ground up, brick by brick, the same way a person rebuilds after discovering the foundation they had been standing on was never quite what they believed it to be. She said nothing further for the rest of the evening, though her eyes returned, again and again, to Alina, studying her now with an entirely different kind of attention than she had offered before, careful and searching, and for perhaps the first time since Alina had arrived in this house, genuinely curious rather than simply suspicious. The dinner concluded not long after, the Ashfords departing with promises to review the merger documents thoroughly before any further discussion of signing, Daniel offering Alina a final, respectful nod on his way out the door that carried far more meaning than his earlier polite greeting had. As the last guests left and the house began settling into the quiet of late evening, Alina stood alone for a moment in the hallway outside the dining room, watching the staff clear away the final traces of the dinner, the candles burning low, the flowers beginning to wilt slightly in their tall vases. She had known, walking into this house 6 weeks earlier, that a moment like tonight would eventually come. She had not known exactly when, or exactly how it would unfold, but she had understood, with the same quiet certainty that had guided her through every difficult room in her life, that patience, properly applied, would eventually produce results that mattered far more than any single dinner conversation. What she had not fully anticipated was how it would feel, standing here now in the aftermath, watching an entire family's assumptions collapse and slowly begin rebuilding themselves into something new. There was no triumph in it, not really, no simple satisfaction of having proven herself right at everyone else's expense. There was only a quiet, steady relief, the particular exhaustion of a person who has finally set down a weight she had been carrying, silently, for far longer than anyone around her had realized. Nathaniel found her there a few minutes later, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly against the top of her head. "You could have told me any of this weeks ago," he said softly. "I could have," Alina agreed. "But I do not think anyone would have believed it, coming from me alone. Sometimes the truth needs the right moment to be heard properly, not just the right words." "Well," Nathaniel said, "you certainly found the right moment." Alina allowed herself, finally, a small, genuine smile, the first one she had shown freely in this house since the night she arrived. "I did," she said, "though I suspect the real work is only just beginning." The days following the dinner unfolded with a strange, quiet momentum, as though the entire Whitmore household had been holding its breath since the moment Alina spoke, and was only now, slowly, beginning to exhale. Word of what had happened at the table spread quickly through the family's small circle of trusted advisors, and by the following morning, Edward had already arranged for a full independent review of the merger documents, insisting that every figure be checked against public records with the same careful scrutiny Alina had applied on her own. The results, when they arrived 3 days later, confirmed what Alina had already suspected, though the full scope of it surprised even her. The $4 million discrepancy in the logistics firm's valuation was not an isolated adjustment. It was connected to a broader pattern of small, careful inflations scattered throughout the acquisition's financial history, each one modest enough to avoid drawing attention on its own, but together, amounting to nearly $11 million in overstated value across the entire deal. Grace Ashford, to her credit, did not attempt to hide or minimize what the review uncovered. She met with Edward and Nathaniel personally, laying out exactly how the adjustments had been made and why, admitting that she had convinced herself, gradually and over many months, that the gap would eventually close on its own once the merger's projected synergies materialized. It was, she admitted, a form of self-deception dressed up as optimism, the kind of small compromise that felt manageable in the moment, and only revealed its true weight once someone finally looked closely enough to add up all the pieces. "I should have said something the moment I realized how far it had gone," Grace told Nathaniel during one of their follow-up meetings, Alina present at his side, quietly reviewing the corrected figures on a tablet in front of her. "I kept telling myself there was still time to fix it quietly before anyone noticed." "Someone did notice," Nathaniel said, glancing toward his wife with unmistakable pride. "Sooner than you probably expected." "Clearly," Grace said, and though her tone still carried the weight of embarrassment, something in her expression toward Alina had shifted into genuine respect rather than the guarded suspicion she had shown at the dinner table. "I want you to know, I do not resent what happened. I think, honestly, I am relieved someone finally caught it before it became something much worse." Alina looked up from the tablet and offered Grace a small, understanding nod. "Numbers have a way of finding the truth eventually," she said. "It is usually less painful to find it early." The corrected deal, once the numbers were properly adjusted, still made sense for both families, though the final valuation shrank considerably from the figure originally proposed. Daniel Ashford, humbled by the entire experience, insisted on additional safeguards being built into the final agreement, transparency measures that would have seemed excessive only a week earlier but now felt, to everyone involved, like simple common sense. "You saved us from a much larger embarrassment down the road," Edward told Alina during a quiet conversation in his study, the same room where he had once shown her his mother's old photographs. "If this had gone through as originally structured, and the discrepancy surfaced later during an audit or a public filing, it could have damaged this family's reputation for years. I do not say that lightly." "I am glad I could help," Alina said. "You did more than help," Edward said. "You protected this family at a moment when very few of us gave you enough credit to expect anything of the sort. I owe you an apology for that, and I imagine my wife owes you a considerably larger one." Margaret's apology, when it finally came, arrived not in a single grand gesture, but in a series of smaller, quieter shifts that Alina found, in some ways, more meaningful than any formal statement could have been. It began with small things. Margaret asking Alina's opinion on a household matter she would previously have decided alone, Margaret pausing during family conversations to make sure Alina had a genuine opportunity to speak, rather than simply assuming her silence meant agreement or incomprehension. The more direct conversation came about a week after the dinner, when Margaret found Alina alone in the garden one afternoon, sitting quietly with a book she was, for once, actually reading. "May I sit?" Margaret asked, an unusually tentative note in her voice. "Of course," Alina said, setting the book aside. Margaret settled onto the bench beside her, smoothing her skirt with careful, deliberate movements, the posture of someone gathering courage for a conversation she had clearly been rehearsing. "I have spent the past week thinking about the things I said," she began, "both at that dinner table and in the weeks before it, when I assumed you could not understand me." "I remember most of it," Alina said gently, though without cruelty. "I imagine you do," Margaret said. "I want you to know that I am not proud of what you heard. I built an idea of who you were within the first few minutes of meeting you, based on very little real information, and I spent 6 weeks refusing to reconsider it, even as you gave me small reasons to do so along the way. That is a failure on my part, not yours." "Why did you decide so quickly?" Alina asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching a bird move through the branches of a nearby tree before answering. "Because it was easier," she admitted finally. "This family carries a great deal of weight, Alina. Every decision Nathaniel makes, every person he brings into this house, reflects on all of us, on decades of work that came before him. I have spent my entire life protecting that weight, sometimes at the expense of being fair to the people standing in front of me. You seemed, at first glance, like someone who might not understand the seriousness of what you were marrying into. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that could have cost this family a great deal of money and reputation, had you not been paying closer attention than any of us realized. I understand the weight of a family name better than you might think," Alina said. "I simply did not need to prove it loudly for it to be true." "No," Margaret said. "I see that now." She turned to look at Alina directly, something softer and more genuine in her expression than Alina had seen from her since the day they first met. "I would like to start over if you are willing, properly this time, without the assumptions I brought with me the first time." Alina considered the offer carefully, the way she considered most things, weighing the sincerity behind the words against the 6 weeks of careful dismissal that had come before them. But she thought, too, of Edward's story of his own mother, of the years it had taken for that family to see her clearly, and of the quiet patience required to build genuine understanding between people who had started from such different places. "I would like that," Alina said finally and meant it. Claire's reckoning came somewhat more awkwardly, delivered in a rush of embarrassed apology a few days after the dinner, cornering Alina in the hallway with the particular urgency of someone who had been rehearsing an apology and needed to deliver it before her nerve failed. "I said some genuinely terrible things," Claire said, barely pausing for breath. "About you being simple, about you only being good for looking pretty at the end of the table. I want you to know I do not actually think that, or I did not mean to think it, or I suppose I did think it, which is worse. But I do not think it any more, obviously, and I am sorry, truly sorry, and I understand if you never want to speak to me the same way again." Alina, who had grown genuinely fond of Claire's sharp, unfiltered energy over the past several weeks despite everything, found herself smiling. "Claire," she said, "breathe." Claire exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Sorry," she said. "I have been rehearsing that for 3 days and it still came out wrong." "It came out fine," Alina said. "I appreciate you saying it. I think we can start again, if you would like to." "I would like that very much," Claire said, and the relief in her voice was genuine and immediate. "For what it's worth, I have told several of my friends the entire story of what happened at that dinner. You have become something of a legend." "I did not do it to become a legend," Alina said. "No," Claire agreed, "but you did it anyway, and that is somehow even better." News of the dinner's dramatic turn eventually reached beyond the immediate family, filtering through the careful social circles that surrounded the Whitmore name, transforming Alina, almost overnight, from a quiet, easily dismissed addition to the family into someone people spoke of with genuine curiosity and respect. She found herself receiving invitations to business gatherings she would previously have been excluded from, questions about her professional background asked with real interest rather than polite condescension. A shift so complete that it occasionally left her slightly bewildered by how quickly an entire social world could rearrange itself around a single evening's events. Nathaniel, for his part, could not seem to stop looking at his wife with a kind of renewed wonder, as though he were meeting an entirely new person who had somehow been living inside the woman he already loved all along. "I keep thinking about all the things I said to you over the past 6 weeks," he admitted one evening, as they sat together in their room reviewing the corrected merger paperwork side by side, a habit that had quickly become a genuine part of their evening routine rather than a courtesy extended to a curious spouse. "Telling you not to worry about my mother, that she would come around eventually, as though you needed my reassurance to handle her. You did not need any of that." "I appreciated it anyway," Alina said, "even if I did not need it the way you thought I did." "Why didn't you tell me from the very beginning everything you actually knew and understood?" Nathaniel asked. "About the language, your background, all of it." "I would have believed you." Alina considered the question carefully before answering, turning it over the way she turned over every important question, examining it from several angles before settling on the truest possible response. "I think, in the beginning, I was testing this family as much as your family was testing me," she said finally. "I wanted to understand who you all really were, underneath the polite version everyone shows to new arrivals. And I do not think I would have learned nearly as much if I had walked in from the very first day, insisting on being taken seriously. People show you who they are far more honestly when they believe you are not paying attention." "That is either brilliant or slightly terrifying," Nathaniel said, though the warmth in his voice made clear which conclusion he had actually reached. "Perhaps both," Alina said, and leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time since arriving at the Whitmore estate, something close to genuine ease settle over her. The corrected merger agreement was finalized 2 weeks later, smaller in scale than originally planned, but built on numbers that everyone involved could now trust completely, a foundation strong enough to support the years of partnership both families hoped would follow. Daniel Ashford insisted, at the signing, on personally thanking Alina for her diligence, a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable at the original dinner and now felt, to everyone present, like the most natural conclusion imaginable. Margaret Whitmore stood beside her son and daughter-in-law at the signing, watching the careful, deliberate way Alina reviewed each final page before allowing anyone to sign, and found herself, not for the first time in recent weeks, quietly grateful that her earlier assumptions about this young woman had been so thoroughly, so completely, and so fortunately wrong. 6 months passed, and the Whitmore estate settled into rhythms that would have seemed unrecognizable to anyone who had witnessed that first uncomfortable dinner, where Margaret Whitmore studied Alina raise like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit the picture she had already drawn for her family's future. The dining room that had once served as a quiet battlefield of careful tests and pointed comments had become, gradually, and without anyone quite marking the exact moment of transition, a place of genuine conversation, the kind where every voice at the table was expected to contribute rather than simply observe. Edward Whitmore had, true to his earlier promise, handed control of the company's Eastern Division fully over to Nathaniel by the end of the year, a transition made considerably smoother by the fact that Alina had become, in every practical sense, an essential part of the leadership team, though her official title remained modest compared to the actual scope of her influence. She reviewed contracts before they reached Nathaniel's desk, caught errors and inconsistencies with the same quiet efficiency she had once applied to invoices at her mother's kitchen table, and gradually built a reputation among the company's senior staff as someone whose careful, understated questions were worth taking very seriously indeed. Margaret, for her part, had undergone the kind of slow, genuine transformation that Alina found far more meaningful than any single dramatic apology could have provided. She began seeking out Alina's opinion on matters both large and small, not out of obligation, but out of what had grown into authentic respect, and the two women had developed, somewhat to both of their surprise, a friendship built on a foundation neither of them had expected when they first sat across from each other at that long dining table. "I never thought I would say this," Margaret admitted one afternoon, the two of them sharing tea in the sitting room while a light rain fell outside the tall windows. But I have come to genuinely enjoy our conversations. I used to dread family dinners, worrying constantly about appearances, about what everyone else might be thinking behind their polite expressions. With you, I find I do not need to wonder. You simply tell me the truth, even when it is not what I want to hear. Especially when it is not what you want to hear, Alina said, smiling over the rim of her teacup. Especially then, Margaret agreed, and the warmth in her voice carried none of the careful, guarded distance that had once defined every interaction between them. Claire, meanwhile, had appointed herself something close to Alina's unofficial younger sister, dropping by unannounced with questions about everything from investment strategies to fashion advice, treating Alina's early quiet reserve as something to be teased about affectionately rather than dismissed with suspicion. The two of them had grown close enough that Claire had begun, half joking and half serious, referring to Alina as her secret weapon in family arguments, since Alina's calm, precise logic had a way of settling disputes that Claire's own sharper temperament rarely managed on its own. The story of that first investor dinner had, over the following months, become something of a quiet legend within the family's wider social circle, told and retold at gatherings with a mixture of amusement and genuine admiration. People who had once looked past Alina at social events now sought her out directly, curious about the woman who had sat silently through weeks of underestimation, before calmly correcting a multi-million-dollar discrepancy in flawless Spanish, at exactly the moment it mattered most. Alina found the attention slightly uncomfortable at first, uneasy with the idea of being reduced to a single dramatic story, rather than understood as a whole person with a history and a career, and a life that extended far beyond one memorable dinner. But over time, she came to see the story differently, not as something that defined her, but as a reminder, both to herself and to everyone who heard it, of a lesson she had learned many times over the course of her life, and would likely need to relearn many more times before it was through. That patience, applied with enough care and enough clarity of purpose, could accomplish things that impatience and confrontation rarely managed on their own. Grace Ashford had, in the months following the dinner, reached out to Alina directly on more than one occasion, initially to finalize the details of the corrected merger, but increasingly simply to talk, the two women discovering an unexpected kinship in their shared experience of working twice as hard as their male colleagues to be taken half as seriously. Grace had eventually taken on a more senior role within her father's company, citing the events of that dinner as an unlikely turning point that had pushed her to stop quietly managing problems on her own and start addressing them directly, no matter how uncomfortable the conversation might be. "I think about that night often," Grace told Alina during one of their occasional lunches together, nearly a year after the dinner that had brought them together in such an unexpected way. "It was humiliating in the moment, watching my own dishonesty exposed in front of everyone. But it was also the moment I finally stopped letting fear of disappointing my father control every decision I made. I owe you more than I think you realize." "You owe yourself the credit," Alina said. "I simply asked a question you were already prepared to answer honestly once someone finally gave you the opening." "Perhaps," Grace said, "though I suspect very few people would have asked that question in the first place, let alone asked it as calmly as you did." Nathaniel, watching his wife move through this new chapter of her life with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the very beginning, found himself continually struck by how little, in the end, had actually changed about her. She was still the same woman who had laughed at his clumsy apology over a spilled glass of wine, still the same careful, thoughtful person who chose her words with precision and her battles with even greater care. The only real difference was that the people around her had finally learned to see clearly what had been true about her from the very start. "Do you ever regret staying quiet for as long as you did?" he asked her one evening, nearly a year after the dinner, as they sat together on the terrace watching the sun set over the same gardens Alina had once studied alone through her bedroom window during her very first restless night in this house. "No," Alina said, after considering the question carefully as she considered most things. "I think if I had insisted on being taken seriously from the very first day, your family would have resisted it, out of pride, out of habit, out of simply not being ready to see me clearly yet. Instead, I let them draw their own conclusions, and then I let the truth correct those conclusions on its own terms, at the moment it mattered most. It was not the easiest path, but I think in the end it was the one that actually worked. My mother certainly would not have believed it if you had simply told her outright that first week," Nathaniel admitted. "She had to see it for herself." "Most people do," Elena said. "I learned that a long time ago, long before I ever met your family. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who have already decided who you are is let them keep believing it, right up until the moment the truth becomes impossible to ignore." Edward Whitmore, watching his son's marriage flourish in ways he had not fully anticipated when Nathaniel first brought Elena home, found himself thinking often of his own mother, of the quiet strength she had carried through decades of being underestimated by people who mistook her modest beginnings for a lack of substance. He had told Elena, during their very first real conversation in his study, that his mother would have liked her, and watching Elena now, confidently guiding the Eastern Division's newest expansion alongside Nathaniel with the same careful precision she had once used to catch a single misplaced figure buried inside hundreds of pages of merger documents, he found himself more certain of that observation than ever. "You built something remarkable here," he told her one afternoon, watching her review a new set of contracts at the long dining room table where, exactly 1 year earlier, she had first revealed the full extent of who she really was. "Not just the marriage, though that matters more than anything else. You built respect, in a house that does not give it away easily, and you built it entirely on your own terms." "I had good teachers," Elena said, glancing up at him with a small, warm smile. "Your mother, though she never knew it at the time, your own patience, even Margaret and Claire, though they might not enjoy hearing that." "They would probably enjoy it more than you think," Edward said. "This family has become better for having you in it, Elena. I hope you know that." Elena set down her pen and looked around the room, at the tall windows letting in the late afternoon light, at the long table where so much had changed in the course of a single dinner, at the quiet, steady life she had built here through patience and precision rather than confrontation. She thought of her mother's kitchen table, of the invoices and the careful pen strokes catching errors no one else believed a cleaning woman's daughter capable of finding. She thought of every room she had ever walked into as someone easily dismissed, and every one of those rooms she had eventually left having proven, quietly and completely, exactly how wrong that dismissal had been. "I know it," she said finally. "I think I have known it for a while now." Outside, the garden stretched green and gold in the fading afternoon light, the same garden she had once watched alone through a window on her very first restless night in this house, uncertain of her place among people who had already decided, without asking her a single real question, exactly who she was. She was uncertain of very little now. She had earned her seat at this table, not through anyone's permission, but through her own quiet, unshakable insistence on being exactly who she had always been, patient enough to wait for the moment that mattered, and sharp enough to make certain, when that moment finally arrived, that no one in the room ever underestimated her again. 3 years later, the Whitmore estate hosted another large family dinner, this one to welcome a new addition to the family circle. Claire's fiancé, a soft-spoken architect named Julian, who had grown noticeably nervous in the days leading up to his first formal introduction to the full Whitmore household. Elena, now the head of the Eastern Division's finance team and a permanent fixture at every major family gathering, watched Julian arrive with a familiar, knowing sympathy, recognizing in his careful, overly polite manner the same nervous energy she herself had carried into this house years earlier. "You look like you are about to walk into an examination," Elena told him quietly, finding him alone near the garden doors shortly before dinner began, straightening his tie with unnecessary precision for the third time in 10 minutes. "Claire warned me this family can be intimidating," Julian admitted. She mentioned something about a dinner where you exposed a merger fraud in 3 languages. I have been dreading tonight ever since she told me the story. Alina laughed, the sound easy and warm in a way it had never been during her own first uncertain months in this house. It was only 2 languages, she said. And I promise, no one here is testing you tonight, not the way they might have tested someone a few years ago. This family has learned a few important lessons since then. What kind of lessons? Julian asked. That the quiet ones at the table are usually paying closer attention than anyone realizes, Alina said. And that it is generally a mistake to assume someone has nothing to offer simply because they have not yet chosen to show you what they know. Julian considered this for a moment, some of the tension easing visibly from his shoulders. Is that advice for me, or a warning to the rest of your family? Perhaps a little of both, Alina said, smiling. Dinner that evening unfolded with none of the careful, testing coldness that had once defined Alina's earliest meals at this same table. Margaret, now genuinely fond of watching new additions to the family find their footing, made a deliberate effort to draw Julian into conversation, asking about his architectural projects with real curiosity rather than the polite, distancing questions she had once reserved for people she had already decided were not worth her full attention. Claire beamed proudly beside him, occasionally squeezing his hand under the table the same way Nathaniel had once done for Alina. A small, quiet gesture of reassurance passed down, it seemed, from one generation of nervous new arrivals to the next. Edward, seated at the head of the table, watched the warmth of the conversation with evident satisfaction, occasionally exchanging a knowing glance with Alina across the table, both of them remembering, without needing to say a word, exactly how different this same room had felt only a few years earlier. It was Nathaniel who eventually raised his glass partway through the meal, drawing the table's attention with the easy confidence of a man now fully settled into his role at the head of the family's growing business. I want to say something, he said, glancing warmly toward Alina before continuing. A few years ago at almost this exact table, my wife sat quietly through an entire dinner while most of us in this family underestimated her completely. I include myself in that, more than I would like to admit. It took her speaking up in her own time and on her own terms for the rest of us to finally understand who we were actually sitting across from. Margaret, seated beside him, nodded with genuine humility rather than the discomfort such a reminder might once have caused her. It was a lesson this family badly needed, she added, looking toward Julian with a warm, encouraging smile. One I hope we remember every time someone new joins this table. Quiet does not mean simple. It rarely does. Julian, still slightly overwhelmed by the warmth of his welcome, looked toward Alina with newfound curiosity. I would very much like to hear the full story sometime, he said. Ask Claire, Alina said. She tells it better than I do and with considerably more enthusiasm. The evening continued long after dessert, drifting into the kind of easy, unstructured conversation that had once seemed impossible in this house, full of genuine laughter and stories exchanged freely between people who had learned, over years of careful, sometimes difficult adjustment, to see each other clearly rather than through the narrow lens of first impressions and inherited assumptions. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house had settled into its familiar late-evening quiet, Alina found herself once again standing by the same bedroom window where she had stood on her very first restless night in this house, looking out at the same dark shape of the gardens below, now grown even more familiar to her with each passing season. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. Thinking about that first night? He asked, somehow always able to sense exactly where her mind had wandered. A little, Alina admitted. I remember standing right here, wondering how long it would take this family to see me clearly. I did not expect it would take a dinner and a discovered fraud to get there, but I suppose some lessons only land properly when they arrive with enough weight behind them. I am just glad you were patient enough to wait for the right moment, Nathaniel said. Most people would have given up on this family long before that dinner ever happened. I almost did a few times, Alina admitted. But I kept thinking of my mother, crossing an ocean with nothing but 2 suitcases and enough determination to build an entire life from scratch in a country that assumed the worst of her before she had said a single word. If she could do that, I decided I could certainly survive a few uncomfortable family dinners long enough to prove myself on my own terms. She would be proud of you, Nathaniel said. I only wish she could see how thoroughly you have won this family over. She already knows, Alina said, smiling softly. I called her the morning after that dinner, the very first thing I did once the sun came up. She laughed for a full 5 minutes before she managed to say anything at all. What did she say once she stopped laughing? She said I finally understood exactly what she had been trying to teach me my entire life, Alina said. That the quietest person in the room is often the one holding all the real power, provided she is patient enough to wait for the moment that matters most, and brave enough to use it fully once it finally arrives. Nathaniel pulled her close, resting his chin against the top of her head the same way he had done on the night of that first dinner, so many uncertain months ago. I think, he said quietly, that this family owes your mother a very large debt of gratitude. She would like that idea very much, Alina said, laughing softly against his shoulder. Though I suspect she would insist on hearing every detail of that dinner told back to her at least a dozen more times before she believed you meant it seriously. Outside, the gardens settled into darkness beneath a wide, quiet sky, the same gardens that had once represented, to a nervous young bride standing alone at a window, all the uncertainty of a family she did not yet understand, and a future she could not yet clearly see. Now they simply looked like home, familiar and steady and entirely her own, earned not through anyone's permission, but through the quiet, unshakable patience of a woman who had always known exactly who she was, long before anyone else at that table finally understood it too. She had been underestimated in that house once, completely and thoroughly, by people who mistook her softness for simplicity and her patience for a lack of substance. She had let them believe it, right up until the precise moment when the truth mattered more than their comfort, and in doing so, she had not only protected her husband's family from a costly mistake, she had also earned something far more valuable than mere respect. She had earned the freedom to finally be exactly who she had always been, fully and openly, in the one place that had once seemed least likely to ever see her clearly. And every time a new voice joined that long dining table, nervous and uncertain the way she had once been, Alina made a quiet point of watching them carefully, listening closely to what they chose not to say as much as what they did, remembering always that the most remarkable people in any room are often the ones who choose, for reasons entirely their own, to let the world underestimate them for just a little while longer. Right up until the exact moment they decide it no longer serves them to stay quiet.